Okay, let's unpack this. We have a powerful stack of sources today that, together, paint a detailed picture of how extreme wealth is created and protected, often, in plain sight, yet cloaked in complexity.
Yeah, what we're really analyzing here is the blueprint for these, well, colossal fortunes moving across time and the methods of control. I mean, from 19th century industrial secrets right up to 21st century algorithmic advantages, they share these common threads of secrecy, sometimes ruthlessness, and definitely an intentional exploitation of asymmetry.
That asymmetry is absolutely key. Our mission in this deep dive is to uncover those invisible structures that concentrate massive power and fortunes, whether it's hiding profits behind a locked office door to manipulate policy or trading markets with a fiber optic cable that shaves off microseconds.
Right.
The story of the elite is fundamentally a story of having information or speed that you, the average person, simply cannot match. We're looking at data on historical business practices, modern financial tech, and, well, the accelerating pace of global wealth inequality.
And if we look at the historical figures, I mean, it's fascinating. We see that wealth wasn't built just on innovation. It was built on understanding and, frankly, manipulating systems, be they financial, governmental, or social. They were kind of the original architects of opacity.
Okay, let's start there with those historical blueprints. Part 1. Historical blueprints for billionaires. Secrecy monopoly. We begin with the foundational titans who built America's industrial base. Take Andrew Carnegie.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't start by blindly gambling on volatile ventures.
Yeah.
He really understood structural advantage. He minimized his risk profile by strategically investing in companies that had what our sources call sweetheart contracts with the powerful railroads, the suppliers of coal, iron, bridge building materials, rails.
Exactly. He wasn't just a steel man in isolation. He was leveraging his position and his deep connections within the Pennsylvania railroad system itself. He knew precisely where the guaranteed demand was. And this leveraging, it extended right into his financial playbook, especially during crises.
We have the perfect example during that massive financial panic triggered by the failure of J. Cook & Co. Credit was completely crippled across the country, right?
Total freeze.
And Carnegie advised his partner, Frick, to pay employees, but, and this is crucial, to freeze payment to no one else.
Yeah, and this wasn't reckless. It was intensely calculated. The rationale behind it was, well, brilliant and pretty ruthless. Carnegie knew that the railroads and his creditors owed him massive sums,
Oh, right.
and they couldn't dare cut off his supply of steel freight, especially since it was arguably their collective financial failure that caused his problem in the first place. So by paying labor, he ensured production kept humming along. By stiffing everyone else, he basically secured massive working capital, interest-free.
Okay, so here's where the theme of secrecy becomes really politically crucial. Carnegie went to extreme lengths to conceal his profits. There's this story where he once showed the chairman of the Bank of Scotland a confidential 2-month earnings statement. The figure was so shocking, a profit of $500,000 a month back then, that the chairman was, quote, almost knocked him from his chair. But Carnegie immediately took the statement back, locked it away.
And the reason for this intense secrecy, this is the central political insight from the source material, really. Revealing those profits, which were just seen as out of all reason for a business of that type at the time,
Right.
it would have made it politically impossible for him to maintain the protective tariffs on imported steel products.
Right. Unpack that a bit. How exactly would revealing the money have destroyed the political viability of the tariffs? What was he arguing publicly?
Okay, so when arguing for tariffs, industrial leaders like Carnegie, they claimed they needed government protection, right, to compete against cheap European steel and, crucially, to protect American jobs. They painted this picture of themselves as fragile entities, operating on razor-thin margins, constantly battling foreign competition.
Okay, the standard narrative.
Exactly. So if the public and, maybe more importantly, Congress saw actual profit statements showing $500,000 a month, well, the political justification for protecting him just collapses instantly. He was basically manufacturing a public narrative of struggle while privately accumulating this, frankly, grotesque wealth behind a legislative shield he helped build. It's financial asymmetry completely weaponized against public policy.
That's a textbook case of leveraging informational asymmetry for political gain.
Wow.
And he applied that same kind of pressure to his own workforce too, didn't he? When he pushed through wage cuts, he wasn't claiming he needed the money for tariffs. He argued he had no choice but to match non-union competition, like the Duquesne Works.
Precisely. He deliberately framed the move to his workers as, and this is his phrasing, clear, so fair. He successfully portrayed labor's struggle not as a conflict against capital against him, but as a conflict against some external non-union competition. It was a superb, really cold piece of managerial propaganda designed to justify transferring the cost of his protected profits right onto his employees' backs.
We see a similar kind of calculated ruthlessness in John D. Rockefeller, though maybe expressed differently, through intense frugality. His mother's maxim, willful waste makes woeful want, clearly guided him. The sources point out he saved $800, which was a full year's salary back then, in less than 3 years working as a bookkeeper.
Yeah, and that kind of thriftiness isn't just a personal habit, right? It's a mindset. It translates directly into business leverage. His early career really hinged on always having capital or collateral ready.
And he used that leverage with, well, great showmanship.
Hmm.
There's the famous story of him needing a significant loan, $50,000, and a local banker, totally unprompted, just offers it to him. But instead of grabbing it immediately.
Right, you'd think he'd jump at it.
He studies the man's face, stalls, and gives that slow, famous drawl. Well, can you give me 24 hours to think it over?
That small pause, that manufactured indifference, it was pure psychological dominance. He understood that by acting deliberately uneager, he signaled to the banker that maybe he didn't really need the money.
Creating leverage.
Exactly, which put him in the absolute strongest position to nail down the most favorable interest rates and terms. It secured his early financial position and also really cemented his image as this shrewd, unhurried operator.
His brilliance was also clearly in branding. Standard Oil, Ohio, the name itself was explicitly chosen to advertise uniform quality at a time when consumers were, frankly, terrified of explosions from impurities common in cheap kerosene.
Yeah, a huge public safety issue.
And he turned it right into his company's core brand promise: safety, reliability.
Yet even the master of calculated silence apparently made a tactical blunder when dealing with the press. When Ida Tarbell began her exhaustive and ultimately devastating investigation into Standard Oil.
Right, a landmark piece of journalism.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Rockefeller refused any cooperation. He told his associates, "Gentlemen, we must not be entangled in controversies. Just shut it down."
Now, was that refusal truly a blunder, though? Or was silence, maybe in his mind, the ultimate demonstration of power? The idea that he was so big, so powerful, he was simply beyond needing to justify himself to a newspaper journalist.
That's a sharp interpretation, and it definitely reflects his ego, for sure. But the source material suggests that this adherence to absolute silence actually backfired. Why? Because it validated the negative narrative she was building in that emerging era of mass media and, growing public moral accountability. Refusing to engage wasn't perceived as strength, but as guilt. By dodging Tarbell, he essentially ceded the entire public narrative, allowing her portrait of the company, this ruthless, monopolistic organization, to solidify without any real challenge from him.
Okay, let's shift from steel and oil to media. William Randolph Hearst. He really understood that wealth and celebrity were, inextricably linked. He cultivated fame based equally on gossip about his complex personal life and the image he meticulously built as a knight on horseback, rescuing the American people from oppressive trusts.
Yeah, he was a kind of populist capitalist, wasn't he?
Yeah.
But as his media empire exploded, he needed serious cash. And his funding strategy was pretty unique for the time, selling bonds in very small denominations, often $500 or even less. The New York Times reported that these small sales actually accounted for 80% of his Eastern bond sales.
Infusing capital that way seems smart, right, connecting directly to the public. But our sources suggest it dramatically changed his political stance. How did selling cheap bonds actually temper his politics?
Well, it basically shifted his allegiance. Once he became deeply reliant on the free flow of capital and was indebted to this wide network of both small and large financiers, it became, let's say, difficult for him to continue the really virulent antitrust and kind of radical anti-capital rhetoric that had defined his early newspaper career.
He had skin in the game now in a different way.
Exactly. He had to temper his radicalism because he was now a major stakeholder in the system he used to rail against. The sources note he began subtly but critically identifying the national interest with the Hearst interests, a big shift.
And the control he exercised was, well, autocratic, bordering on fanatical. The anecdote from his San Simeon estate really drives this home.
Oh, yeah, that story is something else. It just illustrates a total intolerance for any deviation, however small. He and Marion Davies were walking one night, and he spotted this tiny transgression. An employee had picked a single rose on the esplanade, violating a cardinal rule about, disturbing the landscape.
Just one rose.
Just one rose. At 11:30 p.m., Hearst calls the secretary, demands the immediate removal of that employee, that he be, quote, removed from the hilltop permanently. Gone. It just shows that his empire operated under his total unquestioned dominion, where even minor offenses were met with this completely disproportionate corporate exile.
Wow. That kind of fanatical control finds a strange industrial echo in Henry Ford's obsession with efficiency and system at Highland Park. We see this manifested in the production lines, apparatus that could drill 45 holes in an engine block simultaneously, demanding this minute-by-minute orchestration of supply chains and assembly teams.
Ford viewed the Model T not just as a product, but as, destiny. His destiny. We see this autocratic vision in his famous outburst when a new design team dared to introduce a competing modernized model. Ford, apparently in a fit of rage, personally demolished the new car with his bare hands.
No, demolished.
Smashed it up, halted all production plans, canceled contracts for anything that wasn't the Model T. He enforced his vision through sheer destruction.
And he also tried to enforce his ideology on the entire American economy. He started with the, pretty conservative slogan, buy a Ford and save the difference. But then, almost contrarily, he changed it to buy a Ford and spend the difference.
Right. And this shift wasn't just a marketing gimmick. It was basically an economic manifesto. Ford genuinely believed that spending, not saving, was the key to societal circulation and happiness. He saw excessive savings, particularly hoarding by the wealthy, as a fundamental danger that would, in his words, strangle American industry by slowing down demand.
So he was trying to engineer consumption.
Pretty much. He reframed the old Puritan ethic of thrift into a new industrial ethic of consumption. Buy my cars, circulate the wealth, keep my factories running at full tilt.
That obsession with control over production, consumption, and even ideology fueled his intense opposition to government interference later on, didn't it? He railed against the New Deal, sarcastically suggesting everyone should just join the crowd to make it unanimous and have us all live off the government.
This whole historical era really shows that building dynastic wealth requires way more than just money. It requires total control over supply, messaging, and the entire operating environment.
Absolutely. Which sets the stage nicely for the modern era.
Okay, part 2, the modern edge. Opacity in finance and tech. That brings us sharply into the modern world, where the pursuit of wealth is maybe less about maximizing the industrial scale of steel or oil, and more about exploiting microscopic speed and radical complexity, a whole new kind of informational asymmetry. Exactly. We move from the scale of the factory floor to the scale of the millisecond, which is really the new operational frontier for generating wealth. And this is where secrecy transitions from, say, hiding physical profits in a ledger to building systems so convoluted they basically cannot be audited or understood by regulators, let alone the average investor.
So let's dive into high-frequency trading, HFT. The technological arms race there is truly bizarre. Sources recount speaking to developers who actually built these trading systems, and these profits exist in a window of 3 milliseconds. It's 50 times faster than the blink of an eye.
Unimaginably fast.
And the developers said they felt like they were driving a getaway car, being urged constantly, drive faster, without the traders even fully grasping what exactly they were stealing, just that speed was everything.
That microscopic speed is the asymmetry, and it is structurally enabled by intentional opacity within the market system itself. The core mechanism is what's called the maker-taker system of fees and kickbacks used by the exchanges.
Okay, for listeners who haven't heard that jargon, could you break down what the maker-taker system is and why it creates this opacity? Because it sounds technical, but it seems really important.
Absolutely. Let's try to think of it simply. When you execute a trade, you're either making liquidity, basically placing an order that waits on the book for someone else to hit, or you're taking liquidity hitting an existing order that's already there.
Okay, maker or taker. Got it.
Now, exchanges pay a small rebate, essentially a kickback to the makers, which are typically the big Wall Street banks and the HFT firms, for placing those orders. Conversely, they charge a fee to the takers, who are often retail investors like you or me, or maybe large institutional funds like pension funds.
So the pros get paid to trade, and the regular folks pay a fee.
That's the essence of it. The sources describe the system bluntly as effectively paying big Wall Street banks to screw the investors. The rebates become the bait in what they call flash traps, where HFT firms structure their trading specifically to collect these kickbacks over and over again, often by front-running the slower players who are paying the fees.
That structural incentive explains why exchanges keep the system going, I guess. But I was staggered by the level of anxiety they seem to commercialize. We have this detail where exchanges were charging, say, $25,000 a month for a data pipe,
Right.
and then announced an upgrade, widening the pipe for $40,000 a month, a big jump. What was the actual speed gain for that massive fee increase?
This is the crazy part. The increase in speed offered was only 2 microseconds, 2 millionths of a second.
2 microseconds for an extra $15,000 a month.
Yep. They charge a 60% increase in price for an utterly imperceptible gain in speed purely because they prey on the firms terrified of being even marginally slower than their competitors. The expense becomes the price of paralyzing anxiety within this high-speed ecosystem. It's wild.
And this complexity leads to consequences that seem to fundamentally distort basic market principles. You mentioned investors buying shares for 30.001 none. That sounds almost impossible, like a typo. How does adding a fraction of a cent allow manipulation?
Okay, so it exploits a structural rule called price priority. Generally, if you offer, say, $30 for a share, you're at the front of the line for anyone willing to sell at that price. But HFT firms sought out specific, complex order types that allowed them to tack extra digits onto the decimal like $30.0001. This tiny fraction of a penny technically makes it a higher price bid, just barely, but legally higher. And that forces it to jump the queue ahead of everyone else who just bid the round $30. It's essentially a microscopic, algorithmic bribe designed purely to guarantee they execute their trade first.
So they can front-run incoming orders.
Precisely, allowing them to capture tiny, almost risk-free profits millions and millions of times a day.
So we're literally talking about a system where firms intentionally complicate the rules using tiny fractions of a cent simply to guarantee that they are front-running everyone else. That just seems like a clear sign the structure is fundamentally broken, doesn't it?
It certainly appears that way. The alarming conclusion drawn by many market observers is that the entire high-speed industry is intensely opaque by design. In the words of one source we looked at, the people who make the most money want the least clarity possible. This manufactured fog ensures that the rent-seeking, the profits derived purely from systemic advantage rather than fundamental investment insight, can continue completely unimpeded by public or regulatory scrutiny.
Okay, moving from finance to tech and corporate culture. The desire for manufactured success and, well, informational quarantine finds its way into the modern startup culture too, maybe most notoriously with Theranos. But the deception there wasn't just hiding financials, it was hiding the fundamental impossibility of the product itself.
Yeah, the Theranos deception was built entirely on exaggeration and this sort of cult of personality around the founder. Insiders eventually revealed to a board member that the revenue projections the CEO was touting were, quote, hugely exaggerated and impossible to reconcile with the unfinished state of the product. They were basically selling future potential as if it were present reality. Smoke and mirrors.
But the core of the fraud really centered on the technology itself, right? The proprietary device they called the Edison, that little magic box.
Correct. The official inspection report eventually revealed the devastating truth. The Edison device was actually used for only 12 out of the 250 tests on the company's menu. Just 12.
Wow. What about the rest?
Every other test used large, standard commercial analyzers, the kind readily available to any functioning lab. The entire premise of the company, this revolutionary, miniaturized, comprehensive blood testing from a finger prick, was basically a lie sustained by fear, secrecy, and hype.
And when the threatened ban on the CEO from the blood testing business became public, she gave this televised interview expressing devastation and contrition. How was that perceived?
Well, insiders and journalists who witnessed the event observed that the display of emotion seemed purely performative. They got the distinct impression that the contrition was an act, that it lacked any real remorse or empathy. The focus, even when facing absolute catastrophe, remained entirely on image control and managing the public narrative. It's kind of a modern echo of Rockefeller's focus on the standard brand name, maybe.
That focus on narrative control. Speaking of which, the modern mechanism for cultivating total informational quarantine seems to be the extreme use of confidentiality agreements, or NDAs. Oprah Winfrey is cited as a prime example. Her use of gag rules is legendary.
It really is institutionalized in her case. The scope of her confidentiality agreements is described as extreme, designed specifically to cultivate what we might call a protective shield of silence around her. The agreements bind past, present, and future employees, guests on her show, domestic workers, caterers, security guards, dog walkers, and the source even notes, the physician who gave her Botox shots.
That is total informational control. What were the specific rules in the workplace designed to enforce this kind of silence?
Well, the rules explicitly banned cameras, camera phones, and tape recorders at work. These measures were designed specifically to prevent her complex business relationships, particularly the reportedly tumultuous dynamic with her chief operating officer and details of her personal life from ever becoming public knowledge. She wanted an ironclad seal.
And while she publicly claimed these measures were all about trust, analysts quoted in the sources saw them as indicating intense distrust, actually, and an effort to maintain total control over what the public found out about her. This extreme secrecy, much like Carnegie's profit hiding, seems to be about protecting both the business and the personal image of power.
And we see a similar attempt at cultivating invisibility, or at least plausible deniability, in the realm of political influence, what's often called political opacity, or dark money. The sheer scale of money involved here is just staggering. We have data showing $235 million was spent on ads demonizing the Affordable Care Act in just 2 years.
$235 million against it.
Compared to only $69 million supporting it. A huge imbalance fueled by often anonymous sources.
But why should the average person care about a big donor's invisibility? What's the harm?
Because the donor's goal is the special power of invisibility. When you're invisible, you can exert maximum influence. You can shift public opinion, push specific legislative goals that benefit you, without ever facing accountability or public backlash for doing so. You get the policy outcome without the political heat.
We saw this dynamic play out with major political donors like SPF, who tossed tens of millions at various PACs.
Yeah.
Our sources noted he employed specific strategies to make his identity difficult to detect. What were those strategies? How did he hide?
He apparently used a really complicated web of donations structured through multiple political action committees, various shell companies, and certain nonprofit avenues that are legally allowed under current law to shield donor identity. The whole goal was to obfuscate the origin of the funds, essentially treating political influence as just another complex financial puzzle to be solved for maximum untraceable impact.
Until he slipped up.
Right. This continued until a misstep, a slip as the source puts it, finally awakened the beast of journalistic inquiry and public scrutiny, exposing his identity and the scale of his spending.
And sometimes, this dark money isn't just about lobbying. It's used to manufacture the appearance of grassroots support, a concept known as Ersatz-populism, fake grassroots.
Precisely. Take the Koch brothers' campaign for the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, or TABOR, in Kansas. This campaign relied heavily on extensive mass media spending to project this image of broad public support for a measure that, at its core, was designed to fight a proposed tax increase in their home state.
So it served their private financial interests.
Right. While being framed as this broad popular movement bubbling up from the citizenry, it's a classic example of using wealth to simulate democracy.
Okay, let's move into our final part, part 3. The future of capital and inequality. We've established that the historical basis of extreme wealth often involves control and secrecy, and the modern mechanism leans on speed and complexity. Now we need to connect this trajectory to its ultimate effect, accelerating inequality, especially as we face the coming AI revolution.
Right. And to really understand why inequality is growing so dramatically, we have to look at the fundamental mechanics of capital, as defined by economists like Thomas Piketty. His key finding, derived from looking at extensive historical data across many countries, is stark. Inequality with respect to capital ownership is always greater than inequality with respect to labor income. Always.
That distinction is crucial. Capital versus labor income. Can you break down the magnitude of that difference for us? Just how much bigger is capital inequality?
Let's use some concrete figures from the sources. The top 10% of labor income earners, think high-level managers, lawyers, doctors, they receive about 25 to 30% of total labor income. Now, that's a high level of concentration for sure, but it's still spread across quite a few professions.
Okay. Now compare that to capital.
The top 10% of the capital income distribution always owns more than 50% of all wealth. Sometimes that figure climbs as high as 90%, a massive concentration.
And the disparity at the bottom half is even more staggering, isn't it? The bottom 50% of the working population still receives a significant share of total labor income, around maybe 1/4 to 1/3. They work, they earn something.
Exactly. But the bottom half of the wealth distribution, the majority of people owns, and this is Piketty's phrasing, nothing at all, or almost nothing. That share is always less than 10% and generally less than 5% of total wealth. Piketty argues that when you compare these statistics side by side, the inequalities related to labor income, while significant, almost seem mild, moderate, and almost reasonable compared to the extreme structural concentration inherent in capital ownership.
And the nature of this super elite, the very top, has shifted over the last century in the U.S., right? Back in, say, 1929, income from capital dominated the top 1%. But that's changed, hasn't it? It's not just the top 1% anymore.
Yes, that's a key point. Today, in the US, you have to climb much higher up the ladder, all the way to the top 0.1% level before income from capital. And critically, this includes capital gains, becomes the primary resource. Below that rarefied level, the rest of the top 1% is still dominated by extremely high salaries, what are sometimes called super managers. The absolute, often generational super elite, the real capital holders, are now an even smaller, more concentrated group whose wealth is almost entirely divorced from actual labor income.
So if the current system already heavily favors these capital owners, the coming transformation driven by artificial intelligence seems poised to accelerate that shift at an unprecedented rate. How should we think about structuring this coming AI wave? Is there a model?
We can use a four-wave model to structure the impact, as described in some of our sources. The first two waves, Internet AI, which reshape digital content and commerce, think Google and Facebook, and Business AI, which automates tasks for professionals like lawyers, traders, and accountants, these are already heavily implemented and impacting white-collar work.
Okay, so those are here now. What comes next? And how does that start affecting the physical world more directly?
Well, next up is perception AI. This is basically digitizing the physical world. It involves machines learning to recognize faces, understand voice requests, interpret visual data from cameras and sensors, and generally interact more seamlessly with the human environment. Think smart homes, facial recognition, things like that.
And that sets the stage for the final wave.
Which is autonomous AI. And that's likely where the deepest impact on employment will hit, through things like truly self-driving cars, autonomous delivery drones, intelligent robots replacing human tasks completely in factories, warehouses, even service industries.
Right. And the critical variable here seems to be speed. You mentioned this earlier.
Precisely. The transition to a fully AI-driven economy is projected to be far, far faster than previous general-purpose technology transformations like the Industrial Revolution or electrification. Those took generations to fully displace and reconfigure the labor force, but because AI is fundamentally digital, not physical like a steam engine,
It spreads faster.
its adoption and implementation speed could happen within one generation. That leaves displaced workers scrambling to find new roles with maybe non-existent retraining windows. It's a potential societal shockwave unlike anything we've seen before in terms of speed.
This speed and the potential power of AI has led to some really radical, almost utopian predictions about the eventual outcome, hasn't it?
Absolutely. You have thinkers like Ray Kurzweil making quite specific predictions. He foresees human-comparable artificial general intelligence, AGI, emerging by 2029, just a few years away. And he sees the singularity, the point where humans and machines essentially merge or transcend biology happening by 2045. This could lead to possibilities like uploading minds to the cloud, intelligent nanobots repairing our bodies from within. Really sci-fi stuff.
And the optimists, the tech boosters, claim this coming superintelligence will tackle massive global problems for us.
That's the vision put forward by people like DeepMind founder Demis Hassabis. He predicts that the creation of superintelligence will finally allow civilization to solve previously intractable problems, producing inconceivably brilliant solutions to things like global warming, food scarcity, maybe even previously incurable diseases. In this vision, AI becomes almost this benevolent, omniscient force serving human needs.
That utopian vision sounds great, obviously. But first, we have to deal with the immediate economic reality: mass displacement. The main thrust of AI's employment impact, according to many sources, is job replacement, not just de-skilling people for new jobs or creating lots of new AI-related jobs.
That really is the crucial constraint we need to grapple with. While, yes, new specialized jobs like AI data scientists or ethics officers will certainly emerge, the sheer speed and scale of displacement for middle and lower skilled workers likely means society needs a fundamental rethink of how value is created and distributed. The old models might just break.
So if most economic value starts being generated by highly concentrated capital, basically the owners of the AI systems, and large numbers of people are potentially left without traditional work, what is the blueprint for a new social contract that some of the sources suggest? Is there an alternative path?
Well, one concept introduced in the materials is the idea of a social investment stipend. It's designed explicitly not as just basic welfare or universal basic income, UBI, but as a new model that rewards activities deemed socially beneficial rather than only those considered economically productive in the traditional market sense.
Okay, that sounds interesting. What exactly would constitute a socially beneficial activity, and how would this stipend work practically? Is it just getting paid to be nice?
Not exactly. The idea is that this stipend would offer a respectable income and potentially specific career advancement opportunities for professions that demonstrably increase human well-being, but are often undervalued by the market. Think about things like caregiving for the young or elderly, child mentorship, teaching assistance, community organizing, environmental restoration projects.
Things society needs, but doesn't always pay well for.
Precisely. So instead of simply being given money with no strings attached, recipients are recognized and paid for making tangible contributions that build a better, more humane society.
So it seems like an attempt to solve two problems at once: the potential income gap caused by automation, and maybe also the dignity gap that comes from feeling unproductive or unvalued.
That appears to be the explicit goal, yes. By paying these socially crucial but historically low-paid or unpaid professions a respectable salary through the stipend, the policy aims to nudge the entire culture toward a more compassionate direction and simultaneously elevate the status and attractiveness of these vital roles. The ultimate aim is to put the enormous economic bounty generated by AI to work in building a better society for everyone, ensuring that the wealth created by automation doesn't just further enrich the top 0.1%, but actually stabilizes and improves the lives of the majority.
It's a truly fascinating, maybe even necessary, attempt to reconcile the accelerating power of capital with the necessary function of labor and social contribution in a world that's about to be profoundly redefined by massive technological change.
So we've journeyed from Carnegie's calculated use of secrecy to manipulate tariffs and Rockefeller's strategic use of silence through the microscopic complexity of HFT front-running and the, well, carefully constructed deceptions of companies like Theranos. The pursuit of wealth, regardless of the era, seems to consistently rely on control, asymmetry, and intentional opacity.
And as we accelerate toward an AI-driven economy, the inherent structural inequality that Piketty's work highlights so clearly is potentially about to be magnified at generational speed. This new world promises unprecedented bounty, sure, but we really have yet to decide who truly benefits from the fruits of this automated capital.
Which leaves us with an important final question for you, the listener, to consider. If extreme wealth concentration is, in fact, intrinsic to the nature of capital itself, and the coming AI revolution is poised to accelerate that disparity dramatically, will the radical shift proposed by something like the social investment stipend, paying for compassion and community instead of just market productivity, be enough? Will it be enough to prevent the current wealth gap from hardening into an unassailable global oligarchy? Or are we simply accelerating toward a future where the 0.1% are not only the wealthiest, but also the unchallenged owners of the only viable economic infrastructure left?